Hi there, I'm Phil, and I'm an evangelical Christian. What does that even mean? A conservative Christian? A conservative white Christian? A conservative white Christian who votes Republican? There's so much confusion about the term evangelical Christian that we need to take a little trip back in history to figure it out. The word evangelical comes from the Greek word euangelion, which means good news or gospel. Evangelists spread the good news about Jesus. But it wouldn't be until the early 1800s that the word evangelical was used as a noun, as in, that person is an evangelical. And who was described as an evangelical? The followers of preachers like John Wesley, George Whitefield, and Jonathan Edwards, who led the massive 18th century revival we now call the Great Awakening. Revivalists like Whitefield, who in the 1740s was arguably the most famous person in the English-speaking world who wasn't King of England, traveled from town to town across Britain and the American colonies preaching revival. These evangelicals stressed that a Christian wasn't someone who was born in a Christian country or even a Christian family. Being a Christian wasn't the same as being the member of a church. To be a Christian required making a personal decision to follow Jesus, a second birth, according to Jesus' language in John 3:3. What must I do to be saved? You must be born again. So the term evangelical applied to Christians who believe strongly in revivalism and conversionism, the act of making a decision to follow Jesus. Evangelicals also had a high view of the Bible. It was God's inspired word, free from error, and it described real events, miracles, virgin births, and all. This wasn't unusual, though, since virtually all Christians, as of 1740, had a high view of the Bible. But that was about to change, because something was rumbling in Germany. No, not that. Not that either. Yes, there it is, the Tubingen School, a new modern approach to studying the Bible that drew some unsettling conclusions. God's inspired word? Probably not. Error-free? Don't be silly. Miracles? Come on, we're modern. We know better. This new modern theology rattled around Europe for a few decades before landing in America in the 1870s. Presbyterian Bible professor Charles Augustus Briggs announced in 1876 that the new German scholars had proven the Bible was riddled with errors and that the idea that the Bible was the inerrant Word of God was simply a ghost of modern evangelicalism to frighten children. I'm not sure why an error-free book would frighten children, but whatever. Traditionalist theologians fired back, accusing the new modernists of abandoning the fundamental tenets of the faith. And now, it was on like Donkey Kong. Modernist pamphlets were written and sent to churches across America. In 1910, wealthy Presbyterian industrialist Lyman Stewart, Lyman, fired back at the modernists by funding the writing of 90 essays by 64 scholars that were published in a series of widely distributed pamphlets called The Fundamentals. Christians like Stewart, who opposed the new modern theology, were soon calling themselves fundamentalists. The modernist fundamentalist controversy split churches and entire denominations for the next 20 years. Enter this guy. William Jennings Bryan was one of America's more famous men. Congressman, Secretary of State under Woodrow Wilson, Democratic candidate for president not once, but 3 times. Bryan championed the fundamentalist cause against 2 enemies: the modernists, who denied the trustworthiness of the Bible, and a new enemy that seemed to deny any need for God at all: Darwinism. Even though the Tubingen School in Germany predated Darwin by a half-century, the 2 radical new ideas arrived in America at nearly the same time. William Jennings Bryan was up for the fight. He battled modernists from within the Presbyterian General Assembly and battled Darwinists by encouraging states to ban the teaching of evolution in public schools. By the mid-1920s, 5 southern states had banned the teaching of evolution. When Tennessee joined the list, the ACLU offered to defend any teacher charged with the crime. Businessmen from tiny Dayton, Tennessee, wondered if a big court case would be just the thing to put their town on the map. Local science teacher John Scopes volunteered to be arrested. Had he taught evolution? He wasn't entirely sure he had, but since evolution was in the textbook all Tennessee teachers used, he figured he must have mentioned it at least once. and it was time for a trial. But not just any trial, a monkey trial. To say the Scopes monkey trial was the O.J. trial of 1925 is an understatement. It was bigger than the O.J. trial. More than 200 reporters traveled to tiny Dayton, Tennessee from as far away as London. 22 telegraph operators sent out 165,000 words a day. WGN Radio carried the trial live nationwide, a first in American history. An airstrip was built in Dayton so 2 movie cameramen could fly out their film each evening. The Scopes monkey trial occupied the front page of the New York Times and hundreds of other papers for days. But it gets better. Downtown Dayton was decorated for the monkey trial. A local pharmacist acquired the services of a chimpanzee named Joe Mendy, who came dressed in a suit and hat to entertain tourists. Yes, visitors in town for the trial got to hang out with a monkey named Joe Mendy in a business suit. Defending John Scopes was Clarence Darrow, America's most famous defense attorney. On the prosecutor's side, William Jennings Bryan himself, the lion of fundamentalist Christianity. For 6 days, the trial went back and forth on technicalities. But on the 7th day, with the trial moved out of doors because of the heat and fear that the enormous crowd would collapse the courthouse building, Clarence Darrow changed the course of the trial and perhaps religious history in America. Darrow called William Jennings Bryan to the stand for cross-examination as an expert witness on the Bible itself. Unbeknownst to Bryan, Darrow, an agnostic, had worked beforehand with a modernist theologian to prepare tricky questions for Bryan about the Bible. Did Bryan really believe Eve was made from Adam's rib? If Adam and Eve were the only people, where did their son Cain find a wife? When Bryan's team asked for the legal purpose of Darrow's questions, Bryan snapped to cast ridicule on everybody who believes the Bible. Darrow snapped back, "We have the purpose of preventing bigots and ignoramuses from controlling the education of the United States." In the end, while William Jennings Bryan won the trial, fundamentalists lost the war. Major city newspapers mocked Bryan's fundamentalist beliefs. Writing for the Baltimore Sun, columnist H.L. Mencken famously called Bryan a buffoon filled with theological bilge. Fundamentalist Christians he labeled yokels and morons. Public opinion, particularly in big northern cities, had permanently shifted against the fundamentalists. To add injury to insult, 5 days after the trial and before he'd even left Dayton, William Jennings Bryan died. Mocked and without a champion, fundamentalist Christians turned away from the larger culture to focus on building a subculture of their own. Fundamentalist Christianity went into exile. What does this have to do with evangelicals today? Hang on, we're getting to that. Let's back up a bit. The year before the Scopes trial, William Jennings Bryan was sitting at a Bible conference in Winona Lake, Indiana, when he struck up a conversation with a friend about his favorite nemesis, evolution. "If schools and colleges do not quit teaching evolution as a fact," Bryan said, "we are going to become a nation of atheists." His friend took Bryan's words very seriously. His name? Bob Jones. 3 years later, in 1927, Bob Jones founded Bob Jones College, an institution for fundamentalist Christians that would be free of both modernism and Darwinism, and black people, but we'll get to that later. Bob Jones and his son, Bob Jones, and their school, Bob Jones, would become fundamentalist Christianity's most visible champions for the next 50 years. No fundamentalist child attending Bob Jones College would ever bump into a modernist or a Darwinist, or a black person, but we'll get to that later. Here's where the story gets interesting. By the dawn of World War II, American Protestantism had split into 2 major strands: mainline Protestants, whose denominations had either embraced or accommodated modernist theology, and fundamentalists, who were still holding firm to the historical beliefs. But there were some Protestants who didn't feel quite at home in either strand. Enter Harold A Chenge, rhymes with Mockingjay. A Chenge was a Boston pastor who had lived through the modernist fundamentalist split, coming out firmly on the fundamentalist side. He was uncomfortable, though, with the fundamentalism of Bob Jones and others who seemed to be withdrawing from the world, circling the wagons, and disengaging. This separatism was also, in his view, coupled with a growing anti-intellectualism, a rejection of science and the life of the mind, a retreat into purely spiritual matters. Couldn't a Christian hold to a high view of the Bible and engage the world and the mind? Shouldn't there be another way, a third way, between modernism and fundamentalism? A Chenge needed a name for this third way and settled on NeoEvangelicalism, hearkening back to the time of Whitefield and Edwards before modernism had turned fundamentalists inward. To kick this third way into gear, in 1942, A Chenge founded the National Association of Evangelicals, whose members would be churches that held to the biblical positions of fundamentalism without the anti-cultural or anti-intellectual tendencies. Concerned that fundamentalist churches were ignoring the needs of a world at war, A Chenge founded the War Relief Commission as a part of the NAE to funnel donations from churches to war victims in Europe. After the war, the name was changed to World Relief, which continues today as a Christian aid provider with more than 95,000 workers around the world. To promote the life of the mind, A Chenge and three others in 1947 founded a neo-evangelical seminary, Fuller Seminary in Pasadena, California. One of his co-founders was Carl Henry, a very bright graduate of Wheaton College in Illinois. Remember both of those names. So, NeoEvangelicalism had an association, a relief effort, and a school. What it didn't have was a national spokesperson, a champion like William Jennings Bryan or George Whitefield. And now we come to this guy, Billy Graham. Billy Graham's journey is interesting. Growing up near Charlotte, North Carolina, young Graham briefly attended Bob Jones College, but found the environment and teaching overly legalistic. After a stop at the Florida Bible Institute, he ended up at Wheaton College in Illinois. Graham had a magnetic personality and sizable ambition. Not long after graduating from Wheaton, Graham began touring the country as a national speaker for Youth for Christ, a new evangelistic organization founded in 1945. By 1949, Graham was a nationally known figure due to enthusiastic publicity from newspaper baron William Randolph Hearst and Time magazine publisher Henry Luce, who were both impressed by Graham's charisma, but even more by his staunch anti-communism. What does this have to do with fundamentalists and evangelicals? Well, in 1950, Graham, seen here flexing his theological muscles, staged a crusade at the Boston Church of one Harold A Chenge, launching a lifelong friendship between America's newest Christian celebrity and the father of the neo-evangelical movement. Graham and A Chenge both valued the conservative theology of fundamentalism, but disliked the separatism and anti-intellectualism. Both men were also opposed to racial segregation, which put them at odds with many of their Southern fundamentalist brothers and sisters. In 1955, Graham decided the neo-evangelical movement needed its own magazine to compete with the modernist publication, The Christian Century. Christianity Today was launched out of an office near Billy Graham's alma mater, Wheaton College, with fellow Wheaton alumni Carl Henry as its first editor. Remember Carl Henry? Yep. Co-founded Fuller Seminary with Harold A Chenge. It's all connected. So, Billy Graham toured the world. Fuller Seminary taught neo-evangelical pastors and scholars. Christianity Today published magazines. The National Association of Evangelicals and World Relief engaged the culture. Neo-evangelicalism was catching fire in post-war America, and the old fundamentalists were noticing. Unlike the tightly patrolled theological tent of Bob Jones, Sr. and Jr., and University, Billy Graham staged big tent initiatives, even inviting modernist churches and pastors to join his crusades. For the Jones family, this was a bridge too far. Modernists were the enemy, and the friend of my enemy is now my enemy-er. In 1966, when Graham staged a crusade in Greenville, South Carolina, hometown of Bob Jones University, Bob Jones Jr. complained to a local paper that Billy Graham was doing more harm to the cause of Jesus Christ than any living man. Bob Jones Jr. forbid his students from attending the rally under threat of expulsion. Yes, the king of fundamentalism had officially labeled the king of NeoEvangelicalism a heretic. And so the lines were drawn. If you believed the Bible was wonderful but really needed a rewrite to bring it in line with modern times, you were a modernist. If you believed the Bible was the inerrant word of God and modernists and Darwinists were to be avoided like the Black Death, you were a fundamentalist. And finally, if you believed the Bible was the inerrant word of God but didn't want to turn your back on the culture or science or the life of the mind and thought cooperating with people who didn't share all your beliefs was probably okay, you were a neo-evangelical. Though just saying evangelical was much easier and required less explanation. Oh, and there was that one more thing, race. Here we find the starkest contrast between the school Billy Graham first attended, Bob Jones, and the school he ultimately graduated from, Wheaton. Like most schools in the South at the time, Bob Jones College was for whites only. Both Bob Joneses were strong believers in segregation. God had made the races separate, and he intended to keep them that way. The university they founded clung doggedly to one form of segregation or another all the way to the 21st century. Wheaton College, on the other hand, was founded in 1860 by abolitionists and served as a stop on the Underground Railroad. Edward Sellers, the first black college graduate in the state of Illinois, didn't graduate from Northwestern or the University of Chicago. He graduated from Wheaton College in 1866, more than 100 years before Bob Jones would allow a black student to even take a class. Interracial dating wouldn't be allowed at Bob Jones until the year 2000. As of the mid-1960s, the three streams of American Protestantism were very clear. So ask yourself a question. Have you ever heard anyone introduce themselves as a fundamentalist Christian? No? So where did all the fundamentalists go? And here's the final part of our story, and the one force in America that might be more powerful than religion: politics. From the 1920s through the 1960s, fundamentalist Christians were happily separate, disengaged from culture. Why get involved in politics? We have our own schools, churches, radio stations, and TV shows. We're just going to wait for Jesus to return and try to keep our kids from being spoiled by the world. Enter this guy, Jerry Falwell. No, not this one. His dad. No, that's the mayor from Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs. Yes, that's him, Jerry Falwell Sr. In the 1960s, Jerry Falwell checked all the Southern fundamentalist boxes. He was against political involvement, against evolution, against desegregation. He had a church and a TV show. He started a school, Lynchburg Christian Academy, that was one of what would come to be called segregation academies, refuges for white Christian parents concerned about the integration of their public schools. Falwell interviewed segregationists like George Wallace on his TV show and said regarding the races, "When God has drawn a line of distinction, like by giving some of us more melanin than others, we should not attempt to cross that line." And Jerry Falwell would have been happy growing his church, his TV show, and his school if it hadn't been for one cataclysmic event that demanded a response. Roe versus Wade and the nationwide legalization of abortion? That was part of it, but there was something else much bigger. In 1974, the IRS revoked the tax-exempt status of Bob Jones University on the grounds that it was violating the Civil Rights Act by continuing to practice racial segregation. The IRS further threatened to sue all segregation academies across the South if they, too, did not integrate. Falwell was furious. In some states, it's easier to open a massage parlor than a Christian school. Yes, if the Christian school was racially segregated, which was kind of the point of the civil rights movement. Angry Southern fundamentalists like Falwell decided they could no longer stay on the sidelines. Liberal Northerners could take everything away from them. It was time to re-engage. The exile was over. By the mid-1970s, more Americans than ever before were describing themselves as born again, and political strategists were noticing. Falwell and others wanted to build as big a voting bloc as possible, hoping to engage Christians of all stripes, not just fundamentalists, in supporting conservative candidates and conservative issues. But what to call this bloc? The answer had presented itself by the time a born-again Sunday school teacher from Georgia won the White House. Newsweek magazine declared 1976 the year of the evangelical. The media needed a handle for all these conservative white Christians who were suddenly shaping national politics, and almost no one was claiming to be a fundamentalist anymore. When it came to politics, we were all evangelicals. And suddenly, the three strands of white Protestant Christianity in America collapsed back into two: mainline Protestants and everyone else who wasn't black. And everyone else who wasn't black was now an evangelical. So today, Wheaton College is an evangelical school, and Bob Jones University is an evangelical school. Billy Graham is an evangelical, and Jerry Falwell, senior and junior, are both evangelicals. If you're a white Christian and not a modernist or a Catholic, you're an evangelical, which has left the term more or less meaningless. NeoEvangelicalism used to be a legitimate movement, embracing a high view of the Bible while rejecting the excesses of fundamentalism, which included cultural separatism, anti-intellectualism, and echoes, sometimes loud echoes, of racism. But those distinctions have been lost in a race to build a bigger voting bloc, to take back the culture. So, what is evangelicalism in America today? It's a hot mess. What started out as a high regard for the Bible and personal conversion has devolved into a catch-all category for white Christians engaged in conservative politics. A high regard for the Bible, a focus on the work of Christ on the cross, the desire to see people choose to follow Jesus, a desire to help others using our hearts, our hands, and our minds. These are good things. They are neither Republican nor Democratic things. They are biblical things. But today, old currents of fundamentalism are resurgent. The desire to declare war on our enemies, the rejection of mainstream science, the belief that the world is out to get us, the longing for an idealized past, while downplaying or entirely ignoring racial injustice. Even the early 20th century fixation on end times prophecy and the nation of Israel. We could make a video about each one of these topics, but evangelicals like Graham, A Chenge, and many others sought to resist these fundamentalist tendencies while still proclaiming the Bible as the inspired Word of God. That is why I haven't given up on the name evangelical or the ideals of the neo-evangelical movement. Instead, I want to remind us what the movement was all about and what, hopefully, it can be about again.